I know I've technically done the first story of the first Doctor already, but in many ways, this one is ground zero. The Daleks. So, Classic Who review time because it's Sunday, and every Sunday we do new Doctor Who, and at least once a month I do a classic Doctor Who story. So this time I am talking about The Daleks, which is what we call it now. At the time it was 7 episodes each with individual names, because that was how they did those initial episodes for Doctor Who. It was only later they started calling it, under a single title, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, so on. So, yes, this is the Doctor's first ever trip to Skaro, his first encounter with the Daleks. And it is an interesting thing to go back and watch. And I think I often try, I know some viewers feel I don't succeed in this, but I often try to be fair to classic Doctor Who when looking at it and reviewing it and trying to think of how it holds up for something of the time. I try not to be overly harsh on elements that are issues to me as someone watching it from now much later. But at the same time, that does tend to seep in because that's my perspective. I can't change. I can only force myself to a different perspective so far. But this one, I'm trying probably harder than is usual. I had to kind of scrub from my brain everything I know about the Daleks from later on. So all the things, all kinds of inconsistencies or little things that they dropped, almost immediately. Just, for example, things like the fact that they have to move on a metal floor because they absorb static electricity and that's how the tanks are powered. Those sorts of things, not even really gonna dwell on because, that got changed quickly because it was limiting and they realized, we need to do more with these, and they moved on. And I think this one, possibly more than any other episode, you need to try and set your mind back to what it would have been like to see this for the first time. Which I don't think you necessarily have to do with with as many other old stories. Certainly not a lot of because most classic Who stories were one-offs. One-off, aliens, a one-off planet that we're not going to see again. So, and for all intents and purposes, that's what this was at the time they aired it. So to imagine seeing this for the first time, it's pretty impressive in a lot of ways. First of all, let's really take a second to admire the design on the Daleks. It's easy to make fun of now. This little sort of rolling trash can is something that I've referred to them as when I felt like mocking them. In Britain they call them pepper pots a lot. It's an easy thing to make fun of now, but think about how alien that thing actually is. Its shape, its size, its configuration, nothing about that reads as something a human would have put together. That adds to the alienness. And because it is mechanical, because it's the tank, that is the only thing we see. We do get the implication of the mutant inside, but we don't see it. And really that avoids the floppy rubber suit, which was the big fall down of most aliens in 60s sci-fi shows. You make something that looks hard and metal, you can do it much better. And they took advantage of that. And honestly, not even the suckers aren't particularly laughable in this. It's used to hold Ian against a wall. It feels powerful at one point. It's a really impressive piece of design, all things considered. And trying to imagine seeing that for the first time, I get why people were fascinated or possibly terrified by them because of just the strangeness of this thing. And again, at this point, I've been living with this design for a long time, but to try and think back, man, that must have been weird seeing it for the first time. There's also obviously a lot of sort of interesting things in terms of the dynamics. Oh my god, the dynamics of the Doctor himself. This is only the second story with him, so it's more than just him being grumpy. He's very undoctor at times. He he deliberately deceives his companions and, I was going to say knowingly puts them in danger. He doesn't necessarily know how dangerous the situation is, but he absolutely goes against what all three of them want by faking that they can't take the TARDIS back off just so he can go and look at this city. There's the prioritization of his scientific nature, and his humanity is a background feature. It's actually a long time before it comes out. Even after they've escaped to the Daleks initially, he wants to just go right then, and the only reason they don't is because they have to go back to the city to get the fluid link again. And at one point he even says, the Thals are not our responsibility. They're not our problem. And knowing what the Daleks were like and that the Thals were in danger from their very presence, I was cold. Of course, again, the Doctor didn't know the extent of his danger, so he's not totally devoid of empathy, but it basically takes him realizing that the Daleks are going to irradiate the entire planet and kill everything that isn't them before he actually steps up and sort of feels any kind of moral obligation towards helping to stop them. But that's like second to last episode. That it takes a while for him to get there, and it's kind of interesting to watch that because we're used to, regardless of anything else about the Doctor, we're very used to him being, oh, there's a problem here, let me solve it. Here, he doesn't care. He cares about knowledge, he cares about information, then he cares about getting out of there. And it's interesting to go back and watch. And it's a good performance. But yeah, if you're used to modern Doctor Who, that's jarring. Because the Doctor himself is not particularly heroic in this one. I would say even less so than he was in the first one. Very much Ian is framed as the hero, although then we get into this. And this is kind of where my modern perspective is going to seep into things. Like, I'll try and go back in time, thinking of things like the Daleks, but then I look at someone like Ian and go, you're kind of a tool, dude. Like, the extent, like, I get that his archetype, and as a character, he is the kind of a stand back while I do this kind of guy, but the degree of it here is ridiculous. Like, he's had his legs paralyzed by the Daleks, and somebody, one of them is going to be released by the Daleks to go out and get something and come back. And Susan is the most able-bodied at that point. Everyone's stricken with radiation poisoning. She's the one affected the least. It's a duh thing. She volunteers to do it, but he's still like, no, it must be me. Like, oh, for God's sake, man. Although, at the same time, it's hard to blame him too much because, okay, I talked about the Doctor's depiction of being chauvinistic as being overdone in Twice Upon a Time. And I still hold by that. What I feel like is when Moffat wrote that, he set the Doctor as a character about as chauvinistic as the show as a whole could sometimes be in its early runs. Because not only do we have, Barbara frequently on the verge of fainting, Susan, oh my God. I feel like Susan is a beloved character by association with that brilliant speech that the Doctor gives at the end of Dalek Invasion of Earth. Because her depiction so far in the stories I've seen her in, outside of that one, and even that one I need to revisit, she just screams a lot. Like, a lot. Like, even when, like, she's going outside to get the stuff, like I said, she volunteered for this job, but she's running through the petrified forest. No, she's not running from anything. She's traveling from point A to point B, and she can't do it without, oh my God. And then there's more than a few very mocking, silly female things with the Thals, not towards Susan and Barbara, but towards their own, fellow Thal who happens to be a woman. So, and again, I don't want to overstate this. I'm not like, this show is super chauvinistic, it's misogynistic. It's not, but it's of its time in terms of the depictions of characters like Barbara and Susan, especially Ian. I think the Doctor is actually the one who feels like the biggest exception to that dynamic, just because he's cranky and doesn't like anybody. So it's at least more consistent and not overly focused on one's gender. Now, since I brought up the Thals, they are another bit of an iffy point on this. I've mentioned in some other times that one of the strengths of classic Doctor Who was getting to spend more time with the supporting cast in these new locations and getting to know them better. In the case of the Thals, though, it just feels like they kind of rubber stamped out a bunch of repeats of the same, I don't know, 2 or 3 characters. And it doesn't help that they all look really similar. They're almost identically costumed. Pretty much all of them are blonde. Like, it gets really hard to distinguish some of these guys. And they're not especially interesting. Although that wouldn't have been such a problem, except I think this entire story is stretched. It's padded by, probably about 2 episodes. So, like, after they escape the city and they realize we have to go back there, that is a nice raising of tension. Like, but oh my God, we have to go back. But then the amount of time it takes for them to get back. And, like, there's actually an episode called The Ordeal, and it feels like an ordeal to watch it because it's just watching these, Ian and these Thals, crawling through this cave. And, like, why are we being dragged along for this part of it? Like, tell us the route you're going to take so that we understand how you get there, and just get there. Like, at the very least, one of these should have been cut, and it should have only been 6 episodes. Possibly, I think they could have gotten away with 5. Now, you know what? We'll go with 6, because 5, they still get the sort of talking the Thals into sort of taking up arms, which is, I think, one of the more balanced sort of discussions that happens, because Ian, does sort of have the whole, he believes that they should fight, but he also doesn't want to force them to do what's good for them. He's like, they must decide to fight for themselves. And, again, it's a very sort of generically heroic sentiment. And I kind of like that Barbara calls him out a little bit. Like, you're just mixing and matching words. You're still after the same thing we're after. And I kind of like that she calls him out on that. And the show isn't structured in a way to say that she's wrong for calling him out on that. It doesn't necessarily say she's right, but given how in balance some of the depiction of Barbara and Susan versus Ian is, it felt nice. It felt a nice presentation of, here's the situation, here's this one guy's perspective, here's someone calling him out and being like, come on, dude, really? And I think that worked pretty well. Coming back to the Daleks themselves, because I mainly just talked about the design, I like them here for a lot of reasons. This is a good balance of the scheming and the extermination minded. Because unfortunately, as time would go on, they kind of just became shouty stormtroopers. Exterminate, exterminate, exterminate. Like, and we wouldn't have context as to why. And I know that sounds weird, like, why do the Daleks need context? They just kind of want to exterminate everything. And that's true, but I'm like, we get a little into the thought process of the Daleks, and it doesn't make them more sympathetic. It actually kind of makes them scarier, because you realize the reason, at least at this point in this story, that they want to exterminate everything is because that's how they live. Zero regard for damage to anything else. Complete and total self-serving self-centeredness. Our race is the only thing that matters. If everything else dies, fine. Let's do it right now. And it is kind of scary, the single-mindedness of it. But we do get a balance between that desire and that seeking to just tear everything down that isn't them. And that does get called out as well, sort of the otherness with which they view the Thals, and while they will never care about them. But at the same time, there is more underhandedness at play. They are playing some of these characters a little bit. We get to see them scheme, where it isn't just one of them shouting orders at another. And that is an element of the Daleks that I think has largely been lost over time, both in new and classic Who. For the most part, when the Daleks show up, they're just there to be the force of danger and of evil. There isn't a lot of nuance to their planning and what they're up to. Not that I'm saying there should be nuance to them as characters. Like I said, probably not. But there could be more nuance to how they operate. And that has kind of been lost over time, but is more on display here and pretty well balanced. So yeah, I'm not sure I have too much more to say. This one might end up shorter than I would usually go. I don't feel like sort of picking through, each individual thing going on. I hit most of the major things that I wanted to talk about. Oh, one random, little thing, just awesome touch. First episode, they're at the city, and Barbara is wandering through the halls, and the door is closed behind her. Not a sound. Totally 100% silent. No whoosh, no kunk when it hits the floor. Total silence, just, and the door's closed. That was eerie. That was eerie as hell. That was great. Can we get back to the sort of the silent menace of the Daleks? Because I feel like that should be a thing. We've gotten, again, over obsessed with the and the exterminate. Let's have them run silent for a little bit. I think we could really ramp up the creep factor in a story if they played with that again. So yeah, that's the Daleks. It is a landmark episode, but because it is so early, you do see a lot of some of the growing pains of the show and some of the characters as a whole in terms of pacing and characterizations and things like that. But no, it still holds up for the most part. You can definitely see why it helped boost the profile of this show. You immediately get why people latched onto these creatures right away, because they are unique and really effective as villains and really unsettling. So, the Daleks! Have you seen it? What did you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. I'm trying to cut down and not go through the entire of stuff I have. I've got links for all the stuff that you know what to do. It's all down in the description. The big one's Patreon. I'll still single that one out. But other than that, check out the stuff in the description if you care. So until next time, this council is adjourned.